let's go ahead and bring up our interviewer, the Vice President and Chief Information Officer from San Jose State University, Chris Wessells. Welcome.
Hi there. Happy to be here, Carol.
Thanks, Chris. Go ahead and take it away, Chris. It's up to you.
Okay, perfect. Okay, great. Well, really happy to be here this morning. Good morning, everyone. I'm Chris Wessells, as Carol mentioned, serving as the interim Vice President of IT and CIO at San Jose State University, standing in for Ed Clark today, who couldn't be here. I'm truly honored to be here at this keynote session for CSU AI in July with Andy Masley. You may know Andy has some diverse set of interests in IT. He works as an independent writer and researcher funded by a grant from the Coefficient Giving to explore topics in AI and many other areas. Many of his publications are also available on my Substack in case you're interested in exploring more of his writings. Previously, Andy served as the director of Effective Altruism for Citigroup in Washington, D.C. He's also taught high school physics for 7 years, including development of international baccalaureate physics content, of which he's hosting on his YouTube channel. Andy's academic background is in philosophy and physics, in which he double majored at Clark University. And you may all know Clark is based in Worcester, Massachusetts. So with that, I'll get started. And Andy, so to launch things off in this keynote session, I know many people are aware of your writing and work and research about AI and the environment. Yet you also have a strong and passionate interest on effective altruism, or EA. Can you tell us a little bit more about it and why it's important to you?
Yeah, a ton of stuff to say about EA, a ton of different directions we could go here. My main interest is that the basic story of effective altruism is that it's very easy to kind of be like hacked by whatever social status different social problems have into believing things that aren't necessarily correct, or to prioritize ways of doing good that might not be optimal, basically. So there's a lot of different ways this is applied in different areas, most famously in global giving. Specifically, there are all these different opportunities to potentially save a lot more human lives if you're willing to donate overseas to especially malaria charities where a lot of harm is being done. And part of the basic story of effective altruism is that the reason why this doesn't happen is that a lot of the reasons we do good is like kind of sort of to actually do good, but also kind of to be seen as good people. And that can be useful a lot. Like, it's not the case that, like, we should just completely override these social norms or whatever. But there are also a lot of ways that these kind of like social status games can sometimes lead us astray specifically. And sometimes applying like relatively simple numbers to a problem and putting numbers in full context can completely like turn around an otherwise very popular narrative that's taken off in specific social spaces. And so, like, I don't think that me like pointing out issues in the conversation about AI and the environment is like the single most noble thing I could do for the world. Like, I'm not claiming that's like the greatest good I can do, but I do think the background story of EA has been pretty useful to me, where there's a general educated opinion that like, oh, using AI is terrible for the environment. And I think this mostly falls apart if you just put like the relatively simple numbers that we can all agree on it. And like EA has basically guided me to thinking that, oh, it's very possible for a lot of otherwise educated people to be getting the context wrong, even if they're getting the numbers right, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And in fact, Andy, it's sometimes the press uses terms and people latch onto those terms. And oftentimes, there's a backstory to reality. And what I love about your research and how you approach things with effective altruism is that it's evidence-based. And that really reveals the truth in some cases, at least in the material I've read that you've put out. So how has effective altruism shaped the questions you ask about AI and emerging technologies?
Yeah, a ton of different directions to take that. Effective altruism is also pretty famously focused on potential, like arguably very speculative risks from advanced AI. I think part of the motivation for focusing so much on AI in the early days for me was the general idea that like replicating anything that happens in the human brain in machines could potentially be very powerful and very dangerous. And I think I was predisposed to initially see the early days of ChatGPT as a harbinger of like much stranger things to come, basically, partly because they were based on what seemed like a relatively simple scale up of this architecture that just continued to get payoffs as we invested more resources into it. And so I think from the early days, I was pretty lucky to be anticipating that AI would get more and more capable with a lot of caveats. Honestly, I think a lot of stories that effective altruists will tell about AI have also not come to pass. So it's not the case that like, oh, EA is some like the way, the truth, and the light and is never wrong. But I think being willing to step out of a lot of the social games I was in at the time among like, back when ChatGPT was first coming out, like almost everyone that I knew from college especially would say like, oh, this is going to blow over, this is a fad, like people are going to wake up in 6 months and notice that this thing can't do anything useful, and we're not there yet. And I personally find an incredible amount of value in AI in my personal life. And and so like one aspect of this is just taking the capabilities of AI pretty seriously, and then trying to, I think one other aspect of EA that's been pretty useful to me in general is trying to break up the problem specifically. So while I am pretty worried about a lot of the societal effects of AI, like I really don't envy anyone who's teaching students right now as a former teacher, and I genuinely don't know what to do about it. It seems like a mild catastrophe, honestly. And so like I can separate that from also saying that like part of the reason that's happening is that AI is otherwise very useful. Like if AI can ace my old IB physics tests, it's also a sign that it can probably help me out personally with some like physics problems I'm working through. And I think just breaking up the problem into like which things are actually worth pulling levers on and trying to change, and which are maybe a little bit overblown has also been pretty useful to me. And so that's something that's guiding my general perspective as well.
I see. And yeah, and it seems to me that one of the fundamental hallmarks of EA is sort of following that evidence, as you've touched on. There's these sort of elements to getting to the truth, and it's very pragmatic in nature in the way you approach things, even when it challenges our fundamental assumptions on things. So can you share maybe a few examples of when new evidence, or as you're thinking through a complex problem, you've considered new alternatives, or it's actually changed your mind on a topic?
Yeah, I think the first one comes up doesn't really have to do with AI specifically, but I've been vegan for 10 years, mostly for animal welfare reasons. And I've come around to, well, I take the general problem of animal welfare really deathly seriously and think like factory farming especially is just a gigantic catastrophe that a lot of people are ignoring. I've also come around just like looking at a lot of just the numbers we have on people's behavior changes and things like that to actually think that like veganism seems like a much less promising move for animals than I used to think back when I was in my early 20s. Like at the time, that seemed like it just cohered with so much of my identity and it made me feel like a good person. And I do think it was like a good decision for me to do that. But I do worry that there's a lot of aspects of like veganism, as an example, that has actually potentially harmed the animal welfare movement. So, as someone who's also been involved in the climate movement for a while, it would be kind of a disaster if we required anyone thinking seriously about climate to first sell their car. And like, you can't talk about climate until you sell your car, if that makes sense. And that's another kind of extreme lifestyle change. And I think if we required that, then like the climate movement would just kind of die because like a lot of people like need to make these complicated trade-offs in their lives. And it's not to say that driving a car is fine. But in the same way, I worry that veganism has been much more of a barrier. And I've been partly convinced by just like the numbers that we have on people's behavior changes around like how people eat. So that's like the main one that's happened to me in the last like few years. And then with regard to AI in the environment, I think that a lot of the numbers I'm working with are straightforward enough and agreed upon by experts everywhere that like, oh, this is a roughly useful estimate for how much AI emits. I haven't had too many individual moments of changing my mind here so far. Like one general context switch I've noticed is that coding agents specifically do significantly use potentially a lot more energy than normal chatbot prompts for kind of obvious reasons. Because in one, you're getting like a 300, word summary of something, and in the other, the thing can be working for like half an hour on some incredibly ambitious coding project. And so that one specifically has reframed how I talk, where I'll say like, oh, I don't think that using AI as of 2 years ago was super harmful for your environmental impact, but coding agents change the game a little bit where they do add a lot of nuance and complexity to the point where they can actually be a significant part of your emissions on the scale of, say, like your dishwasher, or like even more than that, depending on how much you're using, if that makes sense. So those are two places I can think of.
Yeah, that does make sense. And, stepping back to maybe examples at a university, you touched on, how students are using AI to
Yeah.
basically learn, so to speak. But going back to the university setting, because we are here with the CSU, universities are constantly making decisions about where to invest limited time and resources. Are there any lessons you can think of from effective altruism that higher education leaders might consider as they're looking at the future advancement of academic enterprise, research, et cetera, even administrative activities on campuses?
Yeah, I think the main one that I think about a lot is that it's very, very easy for a very like tenuous, um, like like common agreement on a topic to form, where like the general like, oh, all smart people know that AI is a fad that's going to blow over, or all smart people know that AI will never be able to do X or Y or Z thing. I think universities need to make themselves pretty nimble for just how for the pace of change in AI. Like even if like AI doesn't go really crazy or disrupt all of society, I think it's going to be with us for a very long time, even if the current companies fail. And I think it's just going to have a lot of broad effects on society in general. And I worry that AI is moving fast enough that a lot of what are now like, people will see the current capabilities of models right this second. And then this kind of like what I see is kind of a fake expert consensus will congeal, where I remember like a year or two ago, everyone was like, oh, AI art is like a neat gimmick or whatever, but it's never going to get hands right. Like AI will just never understand hands and and other like simple details of what's going on. And like, that was like AI blew way past that benchmark like 6 months later or something like that. And so I worry that a lot of universities right now are still kind of like reacting to AI's capabilities right this second, forming this idea of like, oh, here's how we react to this now, and not really thinking so much about what the future is going to look like, and not being maybe as intellectually open as we should be toward AI continuing to gain in capabilities and also continuing to stall in capabilities. Like I've also been pretty surprised in ways that AI is actually pretty bad at what it's doing. So I think just remaining nimble is the most important thing. And yeah, like separately, I have become pretty gung ho about just making sure that students get some experience using AI. Like, I don't think students have to love any specific AI lab. They can be incredibly critical of everything that's going on, but they do have to have some general idea of what the models can actually do right now. Just because I see so many otherwise very educated people who haven't touched a model since 2023 and will be like, oh, I tried this once 3 years ago and it was useless. And I'm like, you really have to understand what Fable can do right now, or just like other similar models. Like we're in a pretty crazy time. And again, you can
Indeed.
hate it all, but like you have to understand what's happening. And like I think that's my main ask for how people are thinking about this.
Indeed. And what I'm seeing on campus here, and I'm sure it's true of all universities, is the faculty is very, very divided on the topic. You get some disciplines and faculty that are absolutely opposed to the use of AI, and yet, in our engineering and computer science faculty, and our students are leveraging it for their research and teaching and so forth. So the diversity of perspectives are incredibly complex here in these nascent stages of AI, ML, deep learning, and so forth. And I think to your point, effective altruism is an interesting way to think about this in the academic enterprise, to maybe take a different perspective in analyzing things much more systematically the way you do. So I think it is very applicable for how teaching and learning is going to evolve over the next few years and so forth. But looking ahead, what was one question about AI you think more people should be asking if they want to maximize societal benefit?
Oh wow, that's yeah,
I
a
know
wide
it's a
open
pretty
question.
broad
Yeah.
philosophical question.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like, I'm my credentials here are I like looked at the numbers on AI and compared them to cars and stuff. So I don't want people to say like, therefore we should listen to Andy on the broad trajectory of AI. To be clear, I can pontificate. I'm happy to pontificate, but I want to be clear that I'm just some guy here. Um, yeah, I think the background idea that I've taken pretty seriously since college is I was really into philosophy of mind in my philosophy major and was pretty interested in the idea that like, oh, if you don't assume that the mind is this completely magical thing that's completely separate from nature and instead is kind of this evolved process that responded to specific, like for lack of a better word, algorithms in the natural environment that optimized it over time to do certain things, like the question starts to become like what are the potential limits to what AI can do intellectually, and what does the economy look like when it reaches those limits, if that makes sense? I think like that simple question should guide just like almost everywhere you're thinking about AI. And like people will have wildly different takes about that. Like there are a lot of people who are experts in AI who are way smarter than me who will say that like, yeah, like AI, the current paradigm of AI is incredibly limited and it will continue to progress along certain benchmarks, but ultimately hit up against a lot of barriers before fundamentally changing society. And obviously that's totally legitimate. I don't want to like undermine them, but I think that regardless of what you're thinking about with AI right now, I think asking that very basic question of like, what makes the human mind different from AI? Like, what is it that AI will never be able to mimic, if anything? And like, what happens when it reaches the limits of what it can do? I think just going down a simple rabbit hole of like, what do I believe about economics or the human mind or just other aspects of society can all be incredibly interesting. And I think like that is just a really useful guide in the same way that, I don't know, it sometimes feels like living before the Industrial Revolution and like people
Mhm.
saying like, oh, machines will never be able to lift this amount of weight or something, and being like, oh
Yep,
well,
yep.
if they can apply a lot of force and we can do all these really complicated things in society, what would things look like? And it's very possible that in 100 years, like society looks as strange to us as like, the post-industrial world looks like to very agrarian societies. But I say that as just some guy here, like my
Yeah.
expertise is on how much energy AI models use, not the broad trajectory of AI. So that's kind of just my personal thought.
Yeah, no, that makes sense though. But I think you're spot on. I mean, we are at a point in history that will, 100 years from now, people will look back and say, this is the initial stages of something bigger to come, something much larger that benefits society in many ways and hopefully doesn't damage society. So we've touched a little bit on AI in the environment and in the discussions here, but I'd like to just pivot back to it because you have done some incredibly interesting research on energy and consumption and the value of AI in a much more systematic way, I'd like to say. And so you spent a considerable amount of time carefully examining these claims that about AI, energy, and the environment footprint. So tell us what motivated you to dive so deeply into this topic.
Yeah, I think I was around a lot of educated people who were starting to speak really strangely, not even so much about AI, so much, but actually about climate. So, for the last 15 years, I've been identified with a specific kind of like school of thinking about how we actually reduce people's climate emissions and carbon emissions. And I'm that specific perspective that I'm coming from is very, very skeptical of incredibly tiny cuts in our day-to-day emissions, mainly because of something called the rebound effect, where the idea is that if you make some incredibly tiny cut, like if you say, oh, I care about the climate, so I'm going to stop playing video games 10 minutes earlier than I would have otherwise, or I'm going to stop my microwave 30 seconds earlier. It's actually very likely that something that's happening there is it's freeing up the limited amount of kind of like space and sacrifices you're willing to make for the climate and potentially the guilt you're feeling or the money that you have to spend. and you might just end up spending that somewhere else, if that makes sense. And from what I understand of the research, a lot of people just find that like people who make these incredibly tiny cuts in their lives don't actually have a big effect on their emissions overall. It just seems like a very bad kind of like useless message to get across to people for cutting their individual emissions. And I was finding this a lot in my early conversations about AI and the environment. So I would be at parties and I would offhandedly say like, oh, I use ChatGPT, and people would be like, oh, how can you use that? It uses 10 times as much as a Google search. And my reaction would always be like, we're worried about 10 Google searches worth of energy. Like that's still, like in a relative sense, that's larger, but like a relative increase of 10 for an incredibly, incredibly small absolute value can still yield an incredibly small absolute number. And like that's basically what I found. So my move in my very first post was to basically say, like, oh, look, if you're trying to cut your emissions, like cutting your AI use is kind of like slightly reducing your microwave usage or just like playing video games a little bit less. There's like a noble intent, but it just doesn't really seem promising as a way of cutting your emissions. And like obviously a lot of questions start to flow from that. Like, okay, individual prompts, maybe that's one thing, but what about data centers? What about data center impacts on communities and stuff like that? And so I basically started to go down this very deep rabbit hole where I was noticing similar patterns that I had been very opposed to since I was in college on how to think about and communicate about the environment. Like the biggest one is that it's very, very easy to make any industry look bad if you provide a lot of contextless large numbers. Like if I say like, oh,
Yep.
an AI data center is using millions of gallons of water per day, that can be shocking in the abstract, but basically everything that we do at the scale of society uses a huge amount of resources from the perspective of individuals. And I was finding that a lot of news coverage of AI and of data centers was consistently just giving readers these like very abstract numbers without putting them into context of how this actually compares to other things that we do, if that makes sense. And so my motivation wasn't necessarily to say like, oh, data centers can literally never cause harm, because obviously they're like a major new industry and there are a lot of trade-offs that come with that industry. And there are clear places where data centers have caused harm. But I was pretty worried that a lot of educated people I knew were all basically coming down on the side of like, oh, like this is definitely all really bad. You should definitely not use AI. And I was worried that both of those were motivated by these two background ways of thinking about the environment that I mostly think actually do a lot of harm to how we think about where the real trade-offs are and how we deal with climate change and other problems.
Yep. Yep. And it's interesting that technology actually changes and advances things. So in the data center space, because I spend a lot of time on infrastructure and trying to find efficient ways to support this university and so forth. But we're seeing huge advancements in data center capabilities. I think back to the time when we all had physical servers in our data center, and then there comes virtualization. The virtualization allowed us to collapse servers into, a single device that actually had virtualized servers in it, which had massive effect on decreasing the energy load in our data centers. And I think one thing that's happening today, I've done quite a bit of research on quantum and some of the wafer scale technologies. So the Tesla Dojo wafer and the Cerebrus, I think it's WSE3, massive scale wafer that essentially will reduce energy consumption by a factor of 7 to 10 times over traditional GPU based clusters for AI. And these are the kinds of things where we actually have the technology that's in place today to redesign chips and wafers and so forth to become even more efficient in our data centers. And that to me is some of the most impressive things about technology, is that we just get better and better and better in terms of the use of the physical infrastructure on campuses. So without going too far down that rabbit hole, what are some of the recurring themes in your studies that sort of, you cite statistics and metrics in that they help tell the real story, the truth, or what I would say. And as you touched on, the press there's a ton of misconceptions out there generated by the mainstream media, and we encounter those on a daily basis. So tell us a little bit about the fact that you base things on statistics and the stories that you build to find the truth?
Yeah, a lot of different directions here. I think that one common theme is to literally just ask, like, if you're given a number without context, it's really useful to just put it in context. And a general theme of my writing is that I really don't want people to feel like they have to put any special trust in me or be like, oh, Andy's claiming to be some kind of expert here. Like, what I'm claiming to be is basically someone who's read a lot of the same statistics we all have access to and just putting those statistics on the screen and saying, hey, like by 2030, all of AI data centers and all data centers in America might together rise to use something like 1% of the water we use on irrigated corn in America specifically. And like, I think things like this really just reframe the conversation where this doesn't have to be the final word, but like, I do worry that a lot of people are getting a lot of basic proportions wrong, even though we're all mostly agreeing on the facts. Like another interesting aspect of my writing, I think, is that like people will sometimes perceive me as disagreeing with like the factual claims of these very prestigious institutions, either like journalists or sometimes scientists, but I'm actually almost never doing that. Like I'm just taking the same numbers that we all agree with and applying different normative claims to them instead, where like with AI, especially, my best guess right now, and this is based on a lot of converging estimates from a lot of experts, a lot of whom are much more critical of AI's environmental footprint than I am. Like as an example, like my best guess is that if you're sending normal median chatbot prompts like, Claude or Gemini or ChatGPT, it's very likely that you would have to send something like 200 to 1,000 prompts to raise your daily emissions footprint by 1%. Or even like thousands of prompts to raise your water footprint by 1%. And this, I think, just recontextualizes a lot of how normal people are thinking about this, where I'll just meet so many people who will be like, oh, I try to limit my AI use, or I try to be mindful of my AI use. And like when they say that, I respect their motivations a lot, but it does sound to me a lot like very similar to saying like, oh, I'm trying to, moderate how much time I spend watching YouTube for the sake of the climate. Like I think that person is really just missing where a lot of the really big climate bad guys are and prioritizing something or feeling a lot of guilt about something that I just don't actually think adds up if we just take kind of a sober look at where the levers we can actually pull in our lives are. And so like worrying about AI starts to look to me a lot like just worrying about using the normal internet in general, where like you were saying, actually, one last theme of my writing is that the internet and AI and data centers more broadly are just incredibly energy optimized compared to most other things that we do. It's just really comical compared, like, especially if you think about like if you want to access an ebook versus, like purchasing a physical book, like the carbon impacts of the physical book can be like thousands of times as much as both hosting the ebook in a data center and downloading it, just because we've had 70 years of making computers as optimized to deliver the most amount of energy, most amount of information using the least amount of energy as possible. And like AI does change the game to an extent because like these are very large models, and there's a lot to say about how they use energy in unique ways, but I don't think it changes the story enough where I would encourage people to worry about them. So that was kind of a rant about like the main perspectives that I'm coming from.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the things I find really interesting in your research, Andy, is that you put things in context of trade-offs. So could you just give us an example of how you've done that in the past to come up with answers that one might not ordinarily find on their own, but looking at things in terms of trade-offs, if you don't mind?
Yeah. So ultimately, like this is kind of two separate questions of whether we're talking about the individual level or the community level where people are considering whether to allow a data center to be built in their region. And they're obviously related, but I think we have to separate them for talking about the normative claims. So at the individual level, I think that we are obligated to cut our emissions a lot. Like I take the language of like a climate emergency very seriously. I think that Americans especially just emit way more per capita than anywhere else in the world. And so I think that like finding ways to efficiently make sacrifices in our lives while still retaining a lot of the value is pretty important. And the question is basically where can you do that most effectively? And like there's a trade-off in thinking about like how much you actually want to sacrifice in different places. Like part of the problem with climate change is that most of the things that emit are actually very valuable to us. Like cars make our lives easier. easier, and air conditioning makes our lives easier, and all these other things do too. And so when we're thinking about like telling people you need to make this cut for the sake of the environment, we do have to be very careful about what those cuts are, because like people in general don't have infinite patience for this stuff, including like a lot of like climate focused people. Like I think it's something like the average American says they're willing to spend like $300 a year additionally in like tax revenue, and something like 40% say they're willing to spend nothing to solve climate change specifically. And so there's less appetite for this than we might think, and so we have to be pretty targeted. And so consistently, the things that actually help climate the most are things like driving less, flying less, ideally changing your diet to being vegan, although like that's actually kind of like a lower level thing than the other things I just mentioned. And finally, like ideally living in like a smaller apartment in a larger city where you can like walk a lot. And I'm conveniently checking all of those boxes. So I'm both hyping myself up, but part of the reason I made those lifestyle choices was to like, help my climate impact specifically. And in comparison, like AI is just it. I don't know. When people talk about cutting their AI use for the sake of the climate, it kind of sounds to me like someone who's like spending money on a 7-course meal every day. And they're like, oh, but I still have this Netflix subscription. And like, I should really cut that for the climate. And it's like, well, that's not the main problem you have with your budget. And in the same way, I think a lot of people are missing just how big the orders of magnitude are in the ways that we can affect the climate are, and just how marginal AI is as a specific thing. And then at the community level with data centers, um, my general worry with how this is often talked about, and this actually recently happened in a city near where I grew up in Holyoke, Massachusetts. I really worry that a lot of people are worried about a lot of very specific, sometimes overhyped harms of data centers. And there are definitely some potential real harms. But I worry that people are kind of just looking at these numbers in a vacuum, saying like, oh, we can't build this data center because it will use millions of gallons of water. And they're not considering the pretty crazy tax revenue that data centers generate.
Yep.
Where if you ask like, oh, would the community be willing to pay this amount of tax revenue to reduce their total water usage by 5%? There are a lot of specific situations where I just don't really think that's the case. And so my request for thinking about trade-offs at the community level or the city level isn't so much to say like, oh, ignore all the problems with data centers, everything's fine. And instead to just say like, hey, we need to think seriously about this as a new industry, and we need to add up all the positives and all the negatives of the data center together and ask, is this a worthwhile trade-off as a full seeing the full picture of all the upsides and all the downsides, if that makes sense. And there are definitely places where it's not a worthwhile trade-off. Like, Elon Musk's data centers are consistently a place where I personally think they shouldn't have been built. But there are also a lot of places where they function very well in the communities they're at, and like shutting them down would basically involve the community losing out in anywhere between tens of millions to billions of dollars in tax revenue. And that seems like a big problem. And so I think my request is to basically just look at the full numbers and just ask soberly, like, if AI didn't have this negative halo around it, would this be the thing that you were telling everybody to cut, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it does. Actually, you raised a question in my mind about this tax revenue issue. Maybe you can dive a little bit deeper into it, because it's my understanding that, and maybe I'm wrong, but many communities around in the United States, you'll find that governments subsidize or waive taxes, or give companies opportunities to attract them to move in and build data centers for various reasons. So it seems like there's a loss in potential revenue in some cases in those subsidies. Does that impact the equation on the benefits in any ways? Or maybe you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely does. I do worry that a lot of people are misunderstanding what's happening here, where there are a bunch of different ways that data centers can be taxed specifically. So, you can tax the property, you can tax things involved with the construction, you can tax the land and things like that. And when people talk about data center taxes being waived, they're often talking about one specific category of taxes that are not applying to data centers, which are definitely happening because the community is trying to attract them. Like they're trying to make this trade-off that might
Yep.
ultimately not actually be good for locals specifically. But I worry that what's getting lost from this is that this is again kind of like a description of a relative change where like the tax revenue is dropping by this much. But the question is, okay, so now that we're here, is this new amount of tax revenue a worthwhile trade for the externalities, if that makes sense? So as an example, I live pretty close to Loudoun County, Virginia, with the most data center capacity in the world. The data centers there are providing something like $1.3 billion every year to that county. These are all local taxes. It's not going to the state even. And it's effectively like a money gun that's spitting out $100 bill every 2 seconds. And in exchange for
Wow.
that, like the county is using an additional like 10% of water, 3% of land, and like honestly, a very significant amount of energy. Like I think maybe like 80% of Loudoun's energy goes to data centers. So definitely not nothing. It's a significant trade. And Loudoun, is able to raise these taxes without applying some of the other types of taxes that often get reported on as being like data centers are exempted from, because they've decided that this is the equilibrium of tax rate that makes sense for them for attracting the most data centers while also raising the most tax revenue and avoiding externalities. And so there are different trade-offs at different places. And I don't want to say again that like, oh, data centers shouldn't be taxed at all, because like that would be crazy. Like they're very lucrative, very wealthy companies that should definitely be taxed a lot. But
Yeah.
my general request in these conversations is to look at like separate from what taxes data centers are being exempt from, just like what are they paying now that those exemptions are hitting? And maybe those exemptions are bad, but if the trade-off is either we exempt them or the data center doesn't get built, I think there are still some cases where it's like a worthwhile trade-off, if that makes sense. But this is definitely getting into the weeds a
Yeah.
little bit.
Yeah, it does make sense, but I guess what also comes to mind is that the revenue generated from those taxes in Loudoun and other communities essentially offsets some of the externalities created by the data centers, correct?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'd imagine for the audience that you're probably thinking of a ton of individual issues or problems that have come up in specific data center situations. And so again, I'm really not trying to say that these don't happen. Like these are basically all a bunch of like very real potential threats of a new and objectively very weird industry. Like data centers
Yeah,
are by a lot of standards just very bizarre. And it doesn't surprise me at all that people have a lot of questions and concerns about them. So like my ask
yeah.
isn't to say that like, oh, ignore all these problems, everything's fine. It's to just say that like, given these things are happening and given that you've double checked that this is actually a consistent problem for data centers across the board, like where and when is it worthwhile to build data centers? Like, I would definitely not have chosen to build like XAI's Colossus in Memphis, but I also really wouldn't want to shut down the data centers in Loudoun County specifically. And so like somewhere between those, I think is like a middle ground where people can meet and try to figure out like where and when it makes sense to build a data center in a community.
Makes sense. Um, I got a few more questions before I think we'll open it up to at some point to some of the audience questions. So I'll bring Carol and Felix back in, but there's still a few things I'd like to ask going back to academia in particular. Every university typically in a strategic plan, they talk about sustainability and balancing sustainability goals with being a good steward of resources, et cetera, in academia and in our teaching, research, and administration, and operations of campuses and so forth. So with the growing demand for AI-powered solutions, do you have any advice for institutions in how they might rethink their sustainability goals on a campus today?
Yeah, I think I am kind of in an extreme camp here that again people are welcome to disagree with, but I do worry that when I hear things like this, it sounds very similar to saying like, oh, all our students watch YouTube now, but streaming video makes up a pretty significant share of internet data centers' energy usage, and therefore to be sustainable, we should send out emails with advising on like sustainable usage of YouTube, if that makes sense. And I think that would also basically be a mistake. Like it's true that AI data centers are this massive new industry that from the perspective of, individuals and also like America, just because so many of them are concentrated in America, they are emitting a lot by those standards. But I think by like global standards, they're still a relatively marginal fraction of our emissions. And basically, if I were put in charge of a university's, um, renewability sustainability program, I would really not want to think so much in terms of individual bad guys like, oh, this industry is new and causing new emissions and therefore we should target it especially, and instead ask, like what changes can the university make that will actually reduce our total carbon footprint the most, including student behavior? So if you can produce the numbers that actually show, hey, if we prevent students from using AI this much or limit them this much, that's going to actually have a pretty significant bang for our buck in terms of the climate. Like, if that's actually compelling, then universities should do it. My worry is that in most cases this doesn't actually add up, and it like becomes kind of equivalent to limiting how much students can use microwaves and stuff like that. And like basically for a lot of sustainability goals, it often makes way more sense to me for universities to invest in like, you know, renewable energy, or like finding ways to build like bike paths on campus and things like that, so like people don't have to drive as much. These are kind of like hand wavy. I haven't thought about like the specific trade-offs of universities too much, but like I do worry that sometimes people will ask me like, oh, how can we think about AI sustainably? And my answer to this is like any other digital product, I don't actually think this is an especially promising target for sustainability cuts in the first place. And again, people can disagree. I'm happy to talk about that a lot, but this is my basic background assumption coming in.
Yeah. There's an interesting dialogue going on in the chat. Someone raised the issue of California almond growers, and it occurs to me, you know, California grows most of the almonds in the United States, and you know,
Yeah.
someone had a comment in there that it takes 85 times as much water to flood irrigate our almonds in this state than it does to run a data center. And it's so true. I mean, you got to think about things in context and those trade-offs of how we're using our resources relative to the data center. And, you know, I guess also evaluating costs and benefits of AI. How are organizations that have balanced conversations instead of just framing the issue vaguely, um, how are those organizations finding better outcomes? That is, you know, we hear these terms like AI is harmful, AI is the future. You know, you get these diverse perspectives. How can you encourage sort of debate and getting at the right answers on a campus today? Because that to me is a personal problem in going to our faculty senate and having the discussion and seeing these completely diverse perspectives from faculty in the discussion, like it's the worst thing on earth and then it is the future. So maybe you can offer some advice there.
Yeah, I mean, again, I kind of just feel like some guy in this regard, but I would say that the main thing is that it's really definitely important. Like, climate change is part of the problem with both climate change and water use is that it's often incredibly counterintuitive, specifically, and our preset values and our perception of what's normal versus what's weird, I think is just often so off from where the realities of climate are. So like I really worry, as an example, that like cars just kind of fade into the background as this normal thing that we all do. You know, like everyone has to drive everywhere because it's so useful. And like, you know, cars are one of the main like environmental disasters in the world in general, but like I don't actually hear too many schools like proposing complex plans for how students can drive less. Like it's definitely happening, and where it's happening, that's really great. But I think like my main request for the debate again is that like instead of trying to find these individual bad guys, like whether they be cars or data centers or meat or other things, trying to like kind of detect like, oh, is this evil? Is this good? Like, where does this fit in? I think my general question is to just ask like, hey, like, let's just make a complete estimate of all the different ways that we're emitting, all the different ways that we're using water, because ultimately the goal is to use water sustainably and to emit way, way less and hopefully down to zero soon. And like, once that's contextualized, I think we can go from there. But I worry so many of the debates kind of get lost in this kind of like fog of saying like, oh, but like I have really bad vibes, you know, like I personally have a lot of bad vibes around meat and I'd like people to eat less meat, but I don't think it's really like useful or legitimate to me to storm into a debate and say like, oh, this university has to only serve vegan meals, because I actually also like I've looked at the numbers and I actually don't think even that is anywhere near the most promising way to cut emissions and like often even water use, depending on where you are.
Mhm. Okay, and we'll open it up for some questions in a few minutes with Carol and Felix, but I just wanted to put this one sort of it's sort of the closing question on this keynote. And you know, you spent a great deal of time encouraging people to think more carefully about AI and energy consumption. You know, if you had to leave this audience with sort of just one concept to take away and keep in mind and leverage in their thinking, what would it be? What would you hope to leave the audience with?
I think what I've already talked about a lot, where like I think that ultimately the climate does not care where our emissions come from. It just cares about how much we actually emit. And so I think there's a lot of connection between how much we emit at the individual level and how much we emit at the societal level, because ultimately a lot of society's emissions are kind of just made up of the individual lifestyle choices we're all making, plus a lot of the background infrastructure and stuff. And so in thinking about climate, I think climate is just not super it's not super useful to think about climate and solving climate in terms of identifying individual good guys and bad guys. Like you can viscerally hate AI, you can think that everything about AI is bad and wasteful, and you can definitely argue therefore people shouldn't use it. Like that's all completely legitimate, I think, as a position. But I think what's not legitimate as a position is to say that like therefore this deserves the most focus out of all of the things that we do for the climate in general, just because like for the big issue with climate is that most of the things that emit are actually otherwise pretty useful to us, and simply identifying the things that are kind of like useless and bad and dumb, that has some benefits sometimes, but I think for the most part like it's actually a pretty bad guide to where we can reduce emissions the most. And so for thinking about the environment and taking things seriously, again, I'm not like asking you to like or even like participate in AI at all. Like my main ask is to just like look at the full picture and ask like, is what I'm advocating for actually the most useful lever I can pull right now for the sake of the climate, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And I guess one final question for you out of this discussion. Looking forward, say 3 years, 5 years from now, are you an optimist that things are going to get better in terms of efficiency and how we leverage this new technology?
Um, Probably not, actually. So I think that AI is definitely getting better in terms of efficiency. If you look at the power draw of models with the exact same capability. So as an example, like if I ran GPT-3 today, like GPT-3 probably uses something like 100 times less energy than it did when it was first released, partly because both like algorithms have gotten better, or like GPT level results. I mean, because algorithms have gotten better and also the hardware has gotten much more effective and efficient.
Mhm.
But that's also been completely outpaced by AI getting much larger and just getting much larger and larger models that have qualitatively different abilities, if that makes sense. And so it's very likely that this will oscillate back and forth. And I actually ultimately expect AI to use a lot more of our energy grid in total going forward, like in line with most other people. But that's not coming from the fact that AI is getting less efficient over time. It's coming from the fact that new qualitative tools are coming up where like it's kind of like we used to only have hammers, and the hammers are maybe getting much more efficient, but now we also have like jackhammers that are completely different and
Right.
new. And that's kind of like the difference between coding agents and like GPT 3.5 years ago when ChatGPT came out. And so like it's kind of like a both and situation where I think like as models become more capable, they're going to balance out and eat up a lot of the efficiency gains that we've seen elsewhere to like still be like a pretty significant energy user.
Yeah, and my research, because I do a lot of research on infrastructure, I do believe the efficiency gains from in data centers using new wafer scale technology is absolutely going to change the game in terms of making a much more efficient data centers. It's just getting that transition from massive GPU clusters into a collapsed environment on a large scale wafer is definitely something I see in the future and hopefully will yield some positive results. So with that, I know there's been a ton of Q&A going on and chat going on. I'm going to open this up so we get some of the questions on the table for you from the audience.
Yeah.
So Carol, Felix, could one of you start fielding some questions?
Yeah, there's a lot of questions that have been asked and a lot that you've kind of covered in there. I think one that I haven't really heard, and of course, Andy, like you said, you're not the one person speaking for all AI, right? It's a perspective. But I think people are bringing up, like, what about the humanitarian or equity issues around this? If you want to just maybe address your thoughts or feelings on that. And Chris, likewise.
Yeah, a ton of stuff to say. So ultimately, these are really powerful companies backed by, very wealthy people. And speaking entirely from my personal capacity, like some of them are straight up evil. Like I have to say, like I'm just really horrified that Elon Musk is the richest person in the world right now. So I definitely don't want to say like, oh, this is all fine. We should be like look the other way as these companies operate in this way. And like there are obviously a lot of ways where companies like this have used their power in incredibly bad ways in the past, especially in like speaking on like Memphis and like similar situations where data centers have polluted already very over polluted, overburdened poor communities that have otherwise been victims of environmental racism. I do worry that the really hyper focus on like every last possible negative can also have equity outcomes that are bad in the other direction. So like going back to where I'm from, about an hour away from where I grew up in Holyoke, Massachusetts, that city recently banned a data center, actually. And if you look at the general situation with the city, it's been incredibly poor for an incredibly long time. Its two main like industries right now are basically like marijuana. Like marijuana is legal in Massachusetts, and so there's a lot of like pot growing farms there, which aren't really bringing in that much. And then there's also a mall, and the mall is responsible for something like a sixth of the tax base in the town. And there was this new proposed data center that was going to bring in a ton of like a huge amount of tax revenue to this town that has a very low median income and just doesn't have much of a tax base. Like I think the downtown median income is something like $20,000 a year. It's like very poor by Massachusetts standards anyway. Um, and looking at the like public objections to the data center, a lot of the focus was on this idea that it was going to use way too much water. But I know that area very well. I have like a close friend who's a former city planner there, and the place just has a lot of like basically excess fresh water. Like it's really not lacking in water, especially not the amount that the data center was proposed to use. And there were a lot of other specific concerns, like it could raise electricity prices. But again, like the city just seemed to have a pretty solid plan with the local utility to prevent that from happening. There was some concern about water pollution. I think a lot of the focus on water pollution has actually been pretty confused, where like most famous situations of data centers polluting water have actually come from construction rather than the normal operation of the data center. Can talk about that in a second. And so I think this was a clear place where basically a very poor community that could have really used a lot of tax revenue, and the situation seemed pretty publicly transparent, and the people had a lot of democratic control over it, like hence they were able to ban it. Like I think all of these together like give a sign that this was actually a significant loss for getting people who could really use just a stronger tax base and public improvements in their town. Like basically that was lost partly because of what I personally see as confusion about the state of like what data centers actually do to the places that they're built. And so I worry that like there's somewhere in the middle here where, at least in terms of like the build out of data centers, there are a lot of very serious equity issues and a lot of places where data centers, like other industries, can cause immense harm to local communities. But like I do worry that we also need to consider the upsides of like, oh, a lot of very poor people also just need really good government, well-funded government services specifically, and this money needs to come from somewhere. And if the data center has proven that it can clear these very legitimate hurdles that the public will put up, like I do think we also need to consider the losses of tax revenue as like another equity issue as well, if that makes sense.
I think I agree with that. And one other thing I wish communities would consider is, there are LEED certifications for data centers in terms of sustainability and their capability. If you're a platinum LEED certified data center, I think MIT has one or they built one recently. Those are the kinds of things that can help maybe turn the tide on the political will of a community. If you can make it clear to people up front that this is going to add value to the community, but also, meets these standards, these global standards for certification and sustainability and so forth. I think that's a way you can win in these communities, and I think it'd be prudent in the future for companies to do that. And again, I don't want to defend Elon Musk at all, but I mean, some of the things he's done are pretty valuable. I think of his satellites and that, it's improved communications around the world. But, there's always a mix with individuals like that. Like clearly they're doing some things that are detrimental to society, and yet there's doing some things that are incredibly important as well. So, anyways, any other questions out there, Carol, Felix?
There's a question in the chat that's interesting, Andy. The question asks if there's any regulatory steps at the local, state, or federal level that you've heard of regarding data centers, water usage. What do you know about that?
Yeah, a lot to say. I think that just going down the list, I think that like maybe the worst governed externality of data centers right now is noise. There are a lot of like reasons to think that the normal American governance of noise is just pretty bad and pretty clunky right now, just because noise can come from so many different sources. The law isn't very good at maneuvering around this. And also, data centers provide a very unique, weird noise profile. So, as an example, like I'm experiencing a lot of annoying noise pollution right now. Like on one side of me, there's construction, and on the other side, my neighbor's dogs are really going crazy. And those are both like annoying to me. But like, I have to say that, like, if I had to live very, very close to a data center that was providing a consistent, very low hum, like 24/7, that would actually be much more disturbing to me than the noise pollution I'm experiencing in DC, if that makes sense. And a lot of our current laws around noise aren't really built to catch that because they're built for like very loud noises or maybe noises that are higher pitched than what data centers sometimes provide. And so there are pretty clear regulatory steps that you can take. Like one is just making sure that data centers are set sufficiently far back from where people live. Like there are very clear places where data centers have been really plowed through very physically close to people's homes. That's obviously bad. Changing the laws around like the ways that data centers can emit noise. There are a few specific aspects like the air vents on data centers, the like gas turbines on them. These are all pretty bad. So that's one general thing that I worry about. Um, and two, the other thing that I'm most worried about with data centers is local air pollution, specifically because more and more data centers are starting to rely on on-site gas turbines as their primary source of power. And this can just add a lot of like both PM 2.5 and NO2 pollution to like communities, some of whom are already pretty overburdened. Like we saw this in Memphis. And so I really worry there's this like very common idea taking hold that like, oh, data centers are taking our electricity, so we need to require them to not connect to the grid and bring their own electricity instead. And basically, when people say that, they're actually saying like we're requiring data centers to basically build these massive on-site gas plants. And so there are all these different like populist messages about data centers that can sound like inspiring or sound good, like, oh, we'll require data centers to bring their own power. But what it means in practice is that they'll actually like pollute communities much more. And so I think like my general ask is to actually like not immediately latch on to anything that sounds very good. Like water actually comes up here a lot for me, partly because like the reason why data centers use so much water is to actually use less energy in their cooling systems specifically. Like I can go into the details on why, but basically requiring a data center to use less water is kind of implicitly requiring it to use more power instead. And I think that like while there are definitely places where, you know, there's extreme water stress, like in Arizona, there are a lot of other places where data centers are being built where water is pretty plentiful. And I would really prefer to spend that water as opposed to emitting more from like a nearby gas plant or something like that. And so requiring data centers to use less water isn't always a good idea if you care about the climate, for the same reason that like I would prefer to build more like, you know, hydroelectric power plants, even though those cause more water to be evaporated, rather than like building coal power plants or something like that.
Well, we're at
All right.
time, and we could stay here all day asking and answering questions from Chris and Andy, but we really do appreciate your perspectives, Andy and Chris. Thank you for moderating the session today. There's a lot of questions people still have, so we'll do our best to gather answers where we can and share out what we have. But a lot of it's out there doing your own research, right? Like Andy talked about, is taking a look at it, weigh the costs, and benefits from those things, and make the decisions how it applies to you, and then stay involved. Watch what people are doing, the people who are making decisions for us, but open your perspectives, right? Don't just kind of take one way of thinking that you had in the past and let that dominate your way of thinking, right? So and remember that we're all in this together, and we're trying to figure this out for our students in the CSU system. So once again, I want to say thank you, Chris. Thank you, Andy, for your perspectives. And don't forget to join us tomorrow for the next prompt party. Those are always fun. Carol, any other? I know we want to thank our sponsors. If you want to go ahead and do that.
Yes. Thank you, our sponsors. AWS, we have Boomi as one of our sponsors. New this year, we have Google. We also have our long-term partner Unisys, and new this year, 11 Labs. So thank you to all of our sponsors.
And take a look at the lobby for what's coming up this week. And if you missed something from last week, you can always go back and watch the recording. So thank you all. We hope you have a great day.